Calling all warriors from near and far, welcome to another episode of The Crossroads with your host, Rashida Green. Let's start the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. So this episode is kind of a throwback. Before I decided to take myself a little old nasty break, I recorded this episode entitled Preciosa, which if you know, then you know. But I recorded this last year, actually right around Thanksgiving. And because I was calling myself taking a little break, I didn't put it out. And so I decided to wait and put it out this year, which is actually very appropriate because I plan to do an episode of Stolen Lands on Puerto Rico. But before we get there, this episode I recorded last year, as I said, with a good colleague of mine named Dr. Victor Ayala. And he is obviously from Puerto Rico. And we decided we wanted to have a chat about his home country, what he loves about it, and also, and in more depressing news, I'm really talking about the sterilization of Puerto Rican women. And sterilization, in case you wondered or thought it was only in Puerto Rico, oh, did you think wrong? Oh no, they were also doing it to women as we know, they were doing that to enslaved Africans, women in this country. It's been a practice, unfortunately, for women of color. So I wanted to kind of discuss that. We are also discussing COVID, which around the time we were working on this episode, Omicron was hot in the streets. So you're going to hear some of that. So it was a little bit old information. So don't get too hung up. And Victor definitely gets deep in his nerd, real deep into his nerd business when we're talking about COVID, because that's what he does for a living. He's a PhD scientist working in biomanufacturing. So it's nerd times. I'm going to put some in the YouTube video. I'm definitely going to put some emojis and things because we get real deep. So gird your loins. But I really hope you enjoy this episode. He is definitely a very knowledgeable person and someone that is just very passionate about Puerto Rico and science. So enjoy.
Yeah.
I'm just going to record because it's funny that you are in fact related to Daddy. I believe your father. I believe you are related to Daddy Yankee. And I'm just, as a member of, I'm just waiting for you to, just slide me his phone number.
Still waiting for the free tickets for the concert and all the shows that he promised, or I thought he promised to me.
Yeah, no, he promised you. Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. I am your host, Rashida Green. So I'm not going to give you the long introduction today because I don't feel like it. I'm joined by a friend, by a doctor of stuff that he's going to get into during this episode. I'm joined by Dr. Victor Ayala. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
Hi, Rashida. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm hanging in there. I've had 2 cups of coffee. So ya tú sabes. You already know what's going on. So I love to start the show by giving flowers because we have a lot to talk about and it's science-y. And I love my science. And it's going to be fun because, you and I together kind of can't help ourselves. So it's going to be rich. So in this segment, we like to give our shout outs, our praise to someone living or deceased who has inspired us. Would you like to go first?
I'll take a stab at that. So, okay. I think my career down science really, as you know, I do love to cook a lot and comes from an inspiration actually of cooking. So in cooking, you have to follow recipes, you got to gather ingredients and, it's kind of a trial and testing and trial error kind of process. This weekend, I'm undergoing that process again as we're gearing up for Thanksgiving. Preparing traditional pasteles for the family, which is a recipe that has been handed down from my grandmother, my mother, and now I'm trying to take it up as
That's
well.
awesome.
So my first flowers go to my grandmother who recently passed away, Ernestina Cueva Montero Quiñones. So she was originally from Utuado in Puerto Rico, and moved her family to New York at around, it was in like 1945. And she raised her 6 kids in the projects in New York, and made sure that her kids and all her family moved on from beyond that, and aspired to do bigger and better things. And so I'm here as a result of that woman and my grandfather as well. My grandfather had a donut shop in Queens, New York, and of course my parents, Victor Ayala and Delia Ayala, who gave me my experience and gave me that freedom to explore many type of career options, and always kind of pushing me to reach out and go for bigger things. So
that's awesome. And yeah, ashe to your grandmother. So I have a couple of people that we're going to give flowers to from my side. First,
sure.
In honor of Thanksgiving, right? We're going to
Yes.
give flowers to some indigenous people. So I have a list of the indigenous folks of the state of Maryland. I am likely going to butcher these names, so everybody bear with me. I am not perfect. So first we have the Acohannock Indian tribe, the Assateague peoples. This is where I mess up. I think it's the Nas Waiwash, and it's Nause. The Piscataway Conway tribe, the Piscataway Indian Nation, the Pocomoke Indian people, and the Shawnee. So all the state of Maryland. And also we're giving some flowers to the Taínos, the indigenous folks of Puerto Rico, because we are talking a lot about Puerto Rico today. And on top of all this, because like I said, 2 cups of coffee, actually the bag you gave me. So hype. I'm also going to give flowers to Pedro Albizu Campos. And he was, as I like to say, with the shits. He was not a fan of some of the things that, unfortunately, the United States tried to pull and obviously successfully pulled. And we're going to get into that as well. But before we get there, back on you, friend. I want to know about this. You'd already gave us a little bit of your origin story, but I need more. I want to
go deeper in
there.
Yeah,
man. Come on. Your own personal story, because it's rich, right? And like, you just gave us a lot, but I just want.
I think to me, of course, everyone's own story seems like, oh, that's totally normal. But sometimes I think I do tell other people, and it's just kind of like, dude, what? Like, where do you come from?
So you had me at whale watching. So
if we start back at the beginning, my father was in the military. And so he met my mom in Queens, New York. And they were married in their early 20s. My mother was 19. And so they were in the military, and my father was stationed in Germany. So I was actually born in Second Army Hospital in Frankfurt, Germany, where I lived for 3 or 4 years. So ich liebe dich. I'm a Berliner. No, I'm not really, but
it's fine. I'm not here to catch everything.
I like to joke with that. But from there, we moved to many states. So I grew up and down the East Coast, all the way from New York all the way down to southern Georgia, Alabama for a little while. And then in the 80s, late 80s, my father was stationed in El Salvador. So we lived almost a year in El Salvador. So got to experience that during some of that guerrilla warfare that was going on in the country at the time. And then I went to school at the University of Puerto Rico. Did my bachelor's in biological sciences there at the university in Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, the founding campus. That's where I met my beautiful wife and our group of friends.
Going straight to heaven. To heaven.
I'm still trying to make sure I can join her. And from there, after I got my bachelor's degree, I worked in industry very briefly with Johnson & Johnson, working on surgical sutures, believe it or not, doing the quality control at this facility. So one of the things, I'm not sure in your research, you know, but in Puerto Rico, there shortly after, you know, we received U.S. citizenship, and there were stronger relations established with the United States. There were these huge tax incentives provided to corporations to set up shop in Puerto Rico. And so Puerto Rico was in a process of switching over from a agricultural industry primarily focused on sugar and coffee, to then a, you know, manufacturing high-tech industry. And to this day, there, you know, some of the top 20 drugs manufactured in the US are actually manufactured in Puerto Rico. So those tax incentives have gone away. I would say it's been about maybe 15 years now, but because of the infrastructure that they had set up down there, the relationships they set up with the schools and the universities, there's just a well-trained population down there, and it provides them, one, that ability to ship, you know, materials around the world with ease. They also have that connection to the Latin markets as well. So manufacturing industry is strong. It's dwindling, and there's a strong effort to keep that industry in Puerto Rico. But so that Johnson & Johnson factory, like many factories near my parents' home, they would pick up, you know, college kids. So I worked third shift there for a couple of months to save some money.
Okay.
So I did that for a while, and then I have a family member that was living in Maryland at the time and was willing to let me sleep on her couch if I assisted them with, you know, home repairs and stuff. So I am a little bit of a handyman. So I've worked on their basement and bathrooms and stuff, and helped out at the home while I was trying to, at the time, get a position at the NIH. I had gotten a position with the VA hospital in Baltimore after a couple of months, and then 9/11 happened. So this is late 2001, September 2001, and then I got a call and said, everything's on hold, you know, we'll call you, you know, when things resume. So I waited another 2 months without finding work. So my savings were dwindling. And at the time, Nell, my wife and I, we had been dating for 4 years, and we had already had plans to get married. But she literally single-handedly kind of helped us establish ourselves there. She was still living in Puerto Rico at the time, and she applied for a job in Pentagon City. She was in the hotel industry at the time, and the next day she was given a transfer. So I had been in the States for almost 5 months, you know, tried to landing a job with the NIH and then with the VA hospital, and she was able to transition quickly. So that allowed us to kind of set up shop here. And then at that time, I actually started working for a small biotech, Advanced Bioscience Laboratories. And I was a technician there for 4.5 years. And Dr. Kali Banyambadi's Kali Ramanan. Let me make sure I get that right. Banyambadi Kala Ramanan. I don't want to mispronounce. Kali is a dear mentor to me, and he encouraged me to continue my studies. So while I was working at ABL, I did my master's degree at Johns Hopkins in biotech in the evenings, and then at the completion of that, I went and pursued my PhD at the University of Maryland in Baltimore at the School of Medicine in molecular microbiology and immunology, where my thesis work was around the effects of an underlying infection with Bordetella pertussis, which is the causative agent of whooping cough, and how that subsequently could impact secondary viral infections. Typically, people are looking at the interactions of viral infections and looking at subsequent bacterial infections.
In our case, science day. It's all science.
We're talking a little bit of science. I'm gonna take a mini tangent here, because at the time
we've had like 6 tangents. You don't realize, but I've been like keeping track because I have to figure out where we're going next. But it's fine. Carry on.
But I'm gonna give you a little bit of science because I thought this was interesting, and just the timing of it. But at the time, this was during that period where there was a concern about a new avian flu outbreak or pandemic, right?
A bird flu.
Swine flu. Sorry, I said avian, but transitioning through pigs. And so there was a pretty big outbreak just south of the border in Mexico at the time. And so there were some statistics showing that not only was there emerging a potential pandemic flu down in Mexico, but there was also high incidence of whooping cough. And so our group was interested in pursuing that relationship because pertussis is one of those things that in the States, people are immunized when they're young, but it wasn't until recently, and I say recently in the last 20, 30 years, that they started to provide boosters with the DTaP.
What is DTaP? For the folks that don't know.
A subunit vaccine for diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis, which means that it is a form of recombinant protein rather than using whole cell vaccine, inactivated vaccine. So that's a whole separate tangent.
It is. We're gonna go there. We're gonna put a pin in that.
That's a really interesting topic. But the work that I did there essentially showed that someone that had an underlying, or at least in animal models, I shouldn't extrapolate, but our hypothesis was could an underlying infection with whooping cough make you more susceptible or be more, have a more pathogenic outcome for a secondary viral infection. And the bacteria makes a toxin called pertussis toxin, which inactivates a cellular pathway that allows for cells to kind of migrate to the lungs. And so there's this kind of circular relationship that occurs in pertussis. Infants can get pertussis, and it causes a severe disease in, let me turn off my phone here.
Turn your phone off. Ringing. I think mine's on too.
But oftentimes, and this is one of these weird things, that the people that infect infants tend to be grandparents.
No.
Because immunity wanes. And so hence why when you're older, you get this booster of this DTaP, or at least now they're encouraging it more frequently. So we looked at that relationship, and we did see that at least the toxin could impact your immune response in your airways for potentially up to months following infection. So I really enjoyed my time at Maryland. Had a great mentor.
And this is like, and let's also talk about the fact that like you are the first person in your family to have an advanced degree. Or I mean,
that is correct. My grandmother, though, funny side note there, my dad's mother, she was a very smart woman, and talking about you mentioned Albizu Campo. She did know him. My grandmother was very involved in politics down in Puerto Rico for the PPD, the Partido Popular Democrático in Puerto Rico. She was very involved in politics throughout her life. But the side note about the education was she went to Columbia University when she was 16 years old.
Nice.
And did her master's in political sciences there. So
nice.
I take credit for being the first to get my doctor's degree, but my grandmother actually kind of set the groundwork, getting her graduate degree from Columbia.
That's legacy. So yes, you're just continuing. Absolutely. Yeah, you're just continuing it on. So like, what about Puerto Rico from your perspective makes it so special? I could go on forever about what I think makes it special, and I probably will, but I want to hear from someone who was actually lived there, experienced there. What about it makes it so special to you?
I think so. I'm going to give you a perspective because I think my perspective is kind of unique, right? Mm-hmm. And that I am from Puerto Rico, but I grew up stateside and didn't move there until my father retired from the military. So I got back to Puerto Rico when I was in 11th grade. I would visit yearly. I was in scouts and stuff, and I'd go to summer camps there. And, my parents would let us stay there with the family for a month or two over the summers. So that was always fun. But going back there to live there, I found it was very enticing, and that everything is very intense there. The island is relatively small, right? 100 by 36 miles. But in just that little territory, you have so many, just environmentally, the diversity of environment, the biodiversity is so incredible. You've got beaches, you've got green, lush rainforest mountains, you've got deserts, you've got caverns, you've got metro areas, you've got these very, very rural areas where there's no electricity. And then there's this whole, in Puerto Rico, we had there's a mixture of populations, right? So we've got Black, we've got Spanish Europeans, and then we've got the indigenous population. And I think that has made us so rich in the sense that we've in our people, where we're fortunate to have, I feel, the best of all three.
Everything. Yeah. Pull the car over. It's my turn. Pull the car over. I've been quiet long enough. Puerto Rico is just amazing. Like when I was there, and I remember for a split second, I think I fooled the people because I think they thought I was Puerto Rican, because I walked in and I had a mask on, and the lady spoke Spanish to me, and she was like, "Go wash your hands." And because in my brain, I can't speak Spanish very well, but in my brain, I have a translator that's like, "Hey girl, she just said, go wash your hands." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I just, go do whatever. So she thought, but when I pulled my mask down and I got to stumbling, she was like, "Oh no," because she felt bad that she was just speaking to me in Spanish, just like letting me have it. And my poor translator was like, "Oh no, girl, we're not prepared." So, but anyway, it's beautiful. It's the most beautiful place. Everything about it, even the cucarachas, who can't be called anything else but cucarachas, because they're big, humongous. And I should have been prepared. I guess I should have been prepared, but I was not. They're massive. Oh my God. And I was wondering, I'm like, oh, what is this massive industrial strength insect killer doing in the club?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it's for. But I love it. Bugs.
That's the story.
Huge. But there's so many things, and you're so right. It's so much biodiversity. It's a rainforest, mountains, everything, and it's beautiful. And unfortunately, there's obviously some other not so awesome things, because even though it's cool that, you don't have to fly to Puerto Rico with a passport, there's some terrible stuff that's going on as well.
Yeah,
that is not so fab.
there's a very, very strong yin and yang thing going on there. You're in paradise, but it's so close to hell as well, and unfortunately for some aspects. And so, but just a quick side note on the biodiversity. When I was at the University of Puerto Rico, one of the things I loved to do and I joined was a lab there that was studying the natural amphibian and reptile, sorry, animals, yes. For a lack of a better word, you know,
the animals. I'm just kidding.
I lose I've lost some of my vocabulary here recently, but in that lab, I was studying the natural fauna, the geographical distribution of the coqui, which I know you did fall in love with while you were down there.
I did.
And so we would run all over the island, identifying populations of various coquis. I worked in the lab of Rafael Joglar at the time, which is a well-known investigator in Puerto Rico of the coquis, as well as we studied there was an introduction of people buying pet turtles, specifically the red-eared slider turtle. And so we have an endogenous freshwater turtle called the jicotea. And so I worked with a graduate student for about 3 years, going to all the lagoons and all the freshwater rivers in Puerto Rico to take samples of these turtles, to do genetic testing to see if they were crossbreeding with the red-eared slider. And we did find evidence of hybrids. Unfortunately, there's also a history, which wasn't, started by the US, but there's been a history of introduction of non-indigenous species into the island as a means to control other populations of animals, and then they wind up wiping out some of the indigenous species.
And so like the coqui frog is indigenous to Puerto Rico, right? That's but correct. It has been taken, unfortunately, and put other places, and it's invasive. And we've talked about invasive species several times on this program, but this is just another example of that. And it's such a beautiful sound at night. Like that's, it's so relaxing. But yeah, people were definitely taking these frogs other places. So
yes, they've taken them to Hawaii. They hate them in Hawaii.
Yes, they have. Yeah.
I find kind of heartbreaking because the coqui is very special to us, and so they're trying to wipe them out in Hawaii. But obviously, they shouldn't have been taken to Hawaii to begin with.
No.
But funny side story, and I can give you a bunch of side stories. So tell me when.
I love side stories.
But on one of these trips, and my wife, this is why I fell in love with her. Like, she was not in the sciences at all. And she would join me on these adventures to go catching turtles and catching frogs. And I mean, at 2:00 in the morning, we're in the rainforest in these treks. Like, there's like only a few other people and it's pouring, and she was out there with me. I also worked in the Caribbean Stranding Network. So I don't know if you're noticing a pattern. I like to do a lot of and we worked with the manatees and a rescue mission. But the side story I wanted to tell you was there is a particular coqui. There's 20 species of coqui. Many people don't know that.
I didn't know that.
And they make different call sounds. But there's one that lives specifically in the caves. And they have these really large eyes so that they can see in the caves and stuff. But so I go on one of these treks to these caves. They're called guajones. So it's called a coqui guajon. And we're in these caves, and there's a bug in those caves that is just terrifying. It's frightening. It's just...
Here we go. Oh shit.
See, it's this kind of this massive, and I apologize, I don't know the name.
Don't give a shit. I rebuke in the name.
It was this giant spider. I mean, So it literally just freaked me out. And I wound up seeing this thing on one of these shows later. If you'll remember, what was that crazy show that Joe Rogan had?
Joe Rogan. Fear Factor?
Fear Factor. They had him on Fear Factor and they had to eat these things.
No.
And I remember seeing that. I was like, this is horrible. How did they pull this creature out of this dark cavernous place on some little island to put it on this show for people to eat?
To eat.
So that's my little side note.
Ugh. It always reminds me of that episode of the Chappelle Show where he was, what's his face? Tyrone Biggums was, on Fear Factor, ticking around, just the drugs. But anyway, he's like, I don't know if you know about Joe Rogan, all that stuff. Anyway. So there's some also other not so awesome stuff that's going on in Puerto Rico, but I also want to take the lens out and kind of expand it a little bit because this is kind of the other half of our conversation, which is, we've talked about what you do in vaccine development. We've talked about Puerto Rico as being a place where there was a lot at one point and sort of diminishing now, but biomanufacturing on the island.
Yep.
There's also some, again, not so awesome things as far as the experience with COVID. And I wanted to talk to you about that specifically, like the island's reaction to it, because they've been able to kind of control it, I would say, in a better way than perhaps we have been here in the States. So what is your perspective on just where we are with the vaccine, how Puerto Rico responded to it, and are there kind of any correlations between what we're seeing here in the States?
Yeah, I think what's happening in Puerto Rico is actually a really interesting thing and not, I guess, the common response we've discussed about in the Latinx community, mainly out of necessity. It's purely out of necessity. And what I mean by that is the immunization rate in Puerto Rico compared to the US is actually relatively high. We have over 73% immunization rate on the island. But that was a result of, like I said, out of necessity, because on the island, we're still recuperating 4 years later from the impacts of Hurricane Maria. So the island was ravaged, and at the end of that summer, basically obliterating our medical system. Since that time, Puerto Rico has also undergone some significant changes in the management of our electrical grid system. And one, you would think, what does that have to do with anything?
We're at the crossroads. We're at the crossroads. Let's have it. What's crossroads in Spanish?
Cruza calle. So, en la cruza calle.
Thank you, friend.
Aquí estamos en el cruza calle. This is where it comes. This is where the rubber hits the road. Mm-hmm. You would think, well, what does that have to do with anything? And it has to do with everything: politics, everyday living, and the medical situation. And that is, after Hurricane Maria, our electrical grid system was also in shambles. And so there's been a strong effort to revitalize and improve that system. But our electrical grid system has historically been owned by the government of Puerto Rico. And so that is literally a live wire issue for many people.
You're so corny.
I couldn't help myself.
Corny.
It recently was privatized. And so, as you can imagine, from a political standpoint, a lot of people aren't in agreement with that. A lot of people, unions, that long established unions in the islands were against this transition. And it has impacted a significant amount of people's work as well, that, there's these long-standing government employees who've had secure jobs, and now the company is privatized, and all of a sudden, their safety net, their retirement funds are all in question, and a lot of issues tied to that. And so there's been some blowback to that, and not just people marching and stuff, but literally like facilities undergoing these accidents, in air quotes, where the power's gone out. And so you have these rolling blackouts on the island. I was there recently, as I told you, when my grandmother passed away, but even prior to that, I had gone to see her. And yeah, it was just kind of this, there was no, and it's still, I mean, it's getting better, but there's no security still in our electrical grid system. So you can imagine priorities are hospitals, supermarkets, and police force to maintain order and traffic lights. So all of those systems have to be powered by the grid. If you can't have reliable source of energy, that causes chaos.
Yes.
So I think politicians realized way early in Puerto Rico that we can't mess around. We can't afford to have a pandemic, kill thousands of people on the island. And so I think it was recognized early by people that, no, we're going to crack down hard on this, because our hospital system, our medical system is just not going to be able to withstand, a massive rush of patients. So there has been a strong campaign. I did notice every time that I went to Puerto Rico recently, they have in place really good structure for, checking people's immunization records, testing.
Oh, yeah.
Right. When
they
you
didn't
get to
play
the
that
airport,
shit
they're not
at the
around.
airport. Yeah.
And our people, we enjoy hanging out and partying, and there were curfews put in place,
which was trash, but it's fine. We overcame, because when I was there, they had slid it back just a little bit, and everybody was like, let's have it. Like all the trucks with the speakers in the back, like people were ready to get down.
We can't, we have, we work hard, but we play hard.
Yeah.
And so
I love
it. It's been tough, but people have largely taken the advice of doctors and, and scientists, and the immunization program has been relatively pretty good, and it has saved, literally millions of lives on Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
But as you know, and we can talk about that, that isn't the same on the States. And so I think really this pandemic, when we're talking about this, maybe 20 years from now, the big story is going to be how politics really killed people, rather than how this infectious disease that but we could have bent the trajectory of this thing and chose not to.
And so we're gonna tease this out just a little bit, because I got some stuff, I came that the library is open and that I'm ready to read. But I also want to talk about some of what we're seeing here in the States with regards to just the Black community, the Latinx community, and just like the very unfortunate high death rates and high rates of infection here with COVID. It's just, COVID was one of those things that I was not anticipating having to talk about in 2020. Like we had a whole set list of other topics, and not this, and certainly not how it intersected with folks who were incarcerated, just not thinking it. And also just how it again affected our people in our communities. So do you feel that from your perspective, there is hesitation in the Latinx community in response to the vaccine, that, that people are afraid to get it? Or is it just the circumstances, the social circumstances that may have contributed to the higher rates of infection?
I think I will speak about my very small survey of the Latin folks, my friends that I know here in Maryland, that aren't from Puerto Rico. So they have a different set of issues and concerns about their own status, their well-being. Largely that is driven partly by economics. So in Maryland, we have large Salvadorian population, and I do know folks, and I have friends from other Latin countries, but primarily I would say one of the, if not the largest population of Spanish people of Latinx people in Maryland are from El Salvador. And so knowing a couple of my friends from El Salvador, one is that hesitancy, that fear of, do I really need this? They're hyping this up, this is not really a concern for me. And secondly, can I afford this? Can I legally get a vaccine for free? Because I don't want to jeopardize my own status. That's always a concern for immigrants into the U.S. And I've seen it play out, at least with some of the folks at work, where they are not vaccinated. They have chosen not to be immunized. And so they take a significant risk. I know one person whose son wound up in the ER because of complications to COVID. So that's one part. I can tell you also about family that I have that don't live in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Ricans living outside of Puerto Rico in the US who have a different mentality, right? So they don't have to deal with that struggle of, will I have electricity? Will there, will there be a hospital? No, for them, that's not a concern. They enjoy, that reliability. And I've had family members who have decided not to get vaccinated. And so I had an aunt who died of COVID over the summer, and her grandson and her two daughters wound up in the ER. I have a number of stories, and there I struggle with understanding what their reason was for not getting vaccinated. I mean, I have a cousin who told me, well, and I think I told you this, is her excuse was, well, I want to have kids. And
I'm sorry, you did tell me. Actually, you know what? Park the car, because we're just going to go here. We're going here. Okay, the coffee's kicked back in, because, I completely understand where Sister Fish is coming from, because I can understand where that concern about injectables as it relates to the Black and brown community. Let's have it. Okay, so it's narrative time. Come with me on this journey, friend. Okay, because we're going to talk about how the girls, and by the girls, I mean the U.S. government, was really in Puerto Rico sterilizing.
Absolutely.
So let's have this. Okay, so by 1925-ish, so the currency in Puerto Rico, the actual currency that was in use, was completely devalued at this point. It was the advent of the dollar, and land owned by farmers was being completely taken away from them. We also know, we're taking a bit of a step out, that we had the sugar, what is it? Yeah, I don't know what the term would be. I would call it the sugar migration, but it's, from New Guinea, it's going to different islands in the Caribbean. And we also know what was going on at that time as well. A little thing we like to call Middle Passage. So coming back again to Puerto Rico. So we know that Puerto Rico was very abundant in sugar, and that the US had created this narrative that there was an overpopulation problem going on. And what did they think would help to control this? Birth control, which is the double-edged sword, because we all know that this is a major fight that is still unfortunately perpetuating today. But this is the other side of it. This is the side where women are under the impression that they either have to get on some type of birth control for various reasons, and also now the growing social stigma that there's a problem. And this is where Pedro, I'm going to mess it up, but Pedro A. Campos was not having it. He wasn't having it, because in addition to this, there was a young man, heir to the Procter and Gamble fortune, Mr. Clarence Gamble. So he was someone very interested in investing in eugenic studies in Puerto Rico as it related to this theory of overpopulation. So in 1938, he began to fly Puerto Rican doctors to New York to ask them about the latest happenings in sterilization, which was included in what they call Puerto Rican administrative relief by the New Deal that FDR brought to us, well, to most of us. Black folks were not allowed to participate in the New Deal as so if I had a teacup, I would sip. And, so interesting thing here is that against a lot of their complete understanding, women were being sterilized. They were having their tubes tied to tubal ligation against their understanding of really what that meant. And I'm taking another quick segue because this marries very nicely into our conversation, is also the fear that the Black community has. I'm trying at least to read Medical Apartheid. I have to take breaks because it's so much, not just the information, but just like the stories. So she was also going into details about Thomas Jefferson and his experiments on his slaves.
Really?
How he was doing. Oh yeah. He was an amateur scientist.
Yes.
So take that for what that is in that time. And he was doing bloodletting on his slaves and also was trying to come up with a cure for smallpox by using cowpox, trying to do inoculation with cowpox. Yep. And so like we're talking about the sterilization of women, because, by 1968, I mean, Puerto Rico had the most sterilized population in the world. 1/3 of the women were sterilized. And I told you about a friend of mine who told me that her grandmother was sterilized. She said she was just in there like, boom, boom, popping the babies out. And then one day it all stopped. And and that was why, because after, she'd gone to the hospital, she was sterilized. So I had to get that out. I'm sorry. I feel so much better, angered, but better.
It is a really interesting and dark, part of our history, I guess, and not of our history, but of what we were forced into by the U.S. government. It was put into law. And I think a lot of that was driven also at the time by, the U.S. Had recently acquired Puerto Rico as a territory from Spain following the Spanish-American War. And there was also a demand for troops. And so a large amount of troops were pulled into at the end of World War I, but especially into World War II, after we were given our citizenship. And so women became essential workers in factories at the time. And so you can imagine, not only from population control, but as a business owner, Procter and Gamble, their only workforce left to manage are women and children, right? So, and so making sure that those employees could stay remaining as workers is also an important aspect that they were trying to make a financial decision. I did, we did talk about, I had inquired with, with my mother and my family about this issue. And I thought it was interesting because when I brought up the topic to her, she was like, well, that did happen. And she did know of people that it happened to, but she also explained to me, she was like, our family was so poor that we had, most of the children were born by midwives. And so that was a process that happened to women that would, receive medical treatment at the hospitals. So these were in urban centers where this was primarily happening, not in so much in the rural areas. So both of my parents, family were from rural areas. And so because when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, wow, all of my uncles and aunts, they had 5 and 6, my 9 children. So there were a lot of people being born, and perhaps some better education, would obviously have contributed to doing a better job at that, but forcing people into sterilization, not only is it illegal, but immoral. Without consent. So it's baffling. But unfortunately, Puerto Rico has a long history too of the U.S. implementing things on the island without people's consent. Off the coast, not to go on a tangent, but just off the coast, Puerto Rico's two sister islands, Vieques and Culebra, were used as military training.
Monkey Island.
Yes, and as well. So those islands were occupied for just until recently, right? Less than 10 years ago. They were still being used for military activity, where the U.S. not only would use it, but also lend it to other countries to practice throwing. So one of the highest cancer rates in the U.S. was on that specific island of Vieques as a result of the military use of the island. So,
and and that's another important thing to talk about too, is that Puerto Rico, the reason why it is so valuable and why people really wanted it is because it was such a great vantage point. You could very easily kind of see, easily where things are coming from, even when, and this, of course, like in old San Juan, there's the old like forts with the cannons. And it was very important to have Puerto Rico. And that's why everybody wanted it. And on top of all the other things that we've named about what it had to offer, which is just what like a lot of Caribbean islands have to offer as well, in terms of everything, just everything. It just makes me, what?
It is. And just a quick side note, just so I mean, you and maybe you do know this, but the name itself, Puerto Rico, means rich port. And it was because the Spanish exploited the indigenous people taking all of our gold. When they arrive to the island, they see all these natives and they're blinged out. And it turned into not only a source of gold for the Spanish crown, but the natural currents that come. We are the largest of the small. We are the largest of the small Antilles and the smallest of the large Antilles. And it's no coincidence that Spain and the Spanish landed there, as well as the U.S. establishing one of their largest naval installations because of the currents that go to the Caribbean. And it's also one of the reasons why hurricanes like to pass through as well.
And say, hey.
It's a natural part of the current system that flows up, and it also contributed to the economy of the rum. And
we didn't even talk about the rum.
Yes. But there's a long history of superpowers, if you will, exploiting the inhabitants of Puerto Rico, and the sterilization of women is just another example of that.
Yeah, this got really dark, but you know what? We had to go here. It's post Halloween and also pre-Thanksgiving. It's that precarious time, and we got to just be honest.
So. I think so. And there's something though, I'd also like to talk about that we don't talk about often, because Puerto Ricans have as I would say, like a special relationship or situation that, while there have been these atrocities that occurred on the island, we still benefit from this relationship with the United States, that many other Latinos can be envious of, or just find difficult to understand how some Puerto Ricans would want to separate or become independent. And it's kind of like, well, you guys already have U.S. citizenship. You don't have to go through this process, and you've never had to go across a border to get your family into a safer situation. And there is sometimes, I would say, I wouldn't say animosity, but there is kind of like a, what's the word I'm looking for, where
envy,
a little bit of envy, in the sense, and perhaps even some Puerto Ricans think themselves, to be better off because they have this U.S. citizenship. So it is kind of very interesting dichotomy relationship, right? Where we are that abused spouse, but yet we're married to this very wealthy spouse, and so we put up with a lot of these injustices because of that relationship.
Like the fact that the U.S. owns all of the national parks, to include El Yunque, which is the rainforest.
Yep.
Or the fact that if you are a Puerto Rican citizen, can you vote? I always get that mixed up.
So that's always an interesting question. We do not have representation in Congress, but we do have essentially a lobbyist, a political appointment that does have the ability to lobby in Congress. We do not vote for the president, however, because parties are established in Puerto Rico, so Republicans and Democrats, as well as the independents. We do get to vote on primaries, so we do have a small impact on the outcome of an election, but not directly. Now, where our influence comes into hand is, there's 3.1, 3.2 million Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. There's just about as many Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Almost I think it's around 800,000, 900,000 Puerto Ricans in Florida alone. So we do have the ability to sway an election, and that's always kind of in flux, and it's kind of curious. A quick side note: my dad, who you got to meet, he had the pleasure and the honor of giving Barack Obama and Michelle Obama a tour in the botanical gardens in Puerto Rico when he was running for president.
I stand for your father. I really do. So hard. Everything about him. The fact that like every picture of him, he is just like every time, just always just like this, his aura, whatever. Like I could see that shit. Like it's there. Oh. Of course he got to do this. Of course he did.
Of course he did. He worked. He was, as part of his career in the military, the last 4 years he was working at the White House under George Bush Sr. And so he was a telecommunications officer there, and so he's always had top security clearance. And so when they were
keep your nose clean, that's right.
When they brought when Barack and Michelle were coming to the island, he had the opportunity to be part of that security detail when they visited Gawas, because my dad was in politics in Gawas. So.
Are you going to get into politics? Like you, no, I mean, come on, man. No, man, come on. The Crossroads podcast is like a home of the exclusives. Like I've had a friend of mine and also a podcast guest announce her candidacy for county council. I've done it. So I think that might be my niche, and I'm looking because you've got it in your family. You've got it in spades,
I think you have all the talent and all the skills to go really far with politics. I think you work well with people. I think you're well at organizing people. And
we're not talking about me,
but myself, no, I'm not. I want to make sure my 3 kids get through college, and hopefully I can do some good. I've always had this thought of that I could assist with the development of vaccines, and so that has driven largely my career.
So while we're back on the subject of vaccines, there's a term that's being tossed about, and I think people need a breakdown. What the hell is efficacy? What is it? Why does it matter? Hit it. What can you
efficacy? So I can give you an easier explanation to understand, and then we'll take it humans, right? So it's easier to understand in animal studies, right? Because there you do what is known as a challenge. So basically, when you develop a vaccine, you have to evaluate how the immune response performs in response to the vaccine. So that's your immunogenicity. And so when we're looking at how the immune system performs, we're looking at the production of antibodies, the production of neutralizing antibodies. We're also looking at cell-mediated responses, so how your CD8 T cells and your CD4 T cells are responding to this vaccine. Now, in an animal study, we can do very controlled studies where we can immunize the animals at certain intervals, and then at the end of that portion, the immunogenicity study, then we will perform a challenge study or an efficacy study. And so the animals will be challenged. It could be multiple times, repeated times, or single challenges. And so the number of animals that are protected from becoming infected is your efficacy rate. In people, it's difficult to follow, right? Because you don't know when someone has been challenged. Did they have pre-exposure or not? What was their, antibody titer? But for these clinical trial studies, they monitor that very closely. They're tracking populations. So as the vaccine goes through the various phases required for licensure, phase 1 through 3, and then commercialization, those studies capture initially. You're just assessing the safety of the vaccine, but as it progresses through the various phases, then you're looking to establish efficacy and dosing, which is a critical part now for the immunization of children. Trying to establish what is a safe dose that still provides efficacy for these vaccines is critical.
Thank you for that, because I know people hear these terms and they say them, and I'm kind of like, do you know what it means? And I feel like it's really important, because I am not a anti-vaxxer necessarily. I was very hesitant about getting the vaccine at first, but I did get it. I know I have friends that did not. Most of my family is vaccinated, but there's those of us who just, for whatever reason, chose not to. So I think it's important to hear every side. I wanted to talk about the fears and be real and note that they're not just scary things that people are just making up. Like, for example, I also have family, and very much all my family is just from the South, but having some family in Kentucky, there were in certain areas, specifically the West End, of Louisville, which is like the Black section. They had infirmaries or like these setups across the street where a whole mess of stuff was going on. And actually, yeah, I haven't fully gotten into it yet. Of course, Harriet Washington talks about it in her book too. I just have to take it's such a great book. It's honestly the stuff of nightmares. And, shout out to horror Beyonce, Tanana Reeve, who said that Black history is Black horror. It's just, it's a lot, man. I'm processing a lot of things. I'm processing a lot of things, but I thank you so much for explaining efficacy, because I wanted to make sure that folks really understood that. So
I did want to add, though, just to finalize that point. I think when we look back in history, we were talking about, what people were going to talk about, this virus infection. But the other thing that they're going to talk about when we look back in history is the moment when we fundamentally changed how fast a vaccine could be deployed. We literally went from knowing that there was an outbreak, which still under investigation. Was it an actual outbreak, or was this something that was, escaped a lab? But the fact that we had a sequence, and within 3 months we had a vaccine design, and then in less than a year later we had a commercial vaccine, that is the fastest production of a vaccine in the history of mankind. A lot of things had to come into place. This is built on a lot of research that had been occurring for the last 15, 20 years in the mRNA space. And that space was littered with a lot of issues because mRNA is essentially what our cells detect when you become infected by a virus. And so viruses, or I should say, our cells have evolved many mechanisms for detecting viral infections. And viruses have come up with many ways to avoid that detection system. And so,
oh, wait. I just want to tease real quick. So can you give some examples of diseases that do that? I got two, I think, one or two, one and a possible, but I want to hear from you first.
So essentially, all viruses have evolved strategies to inhibit the detection system. So our cells have an interferon system. So our cells have receptors that are called pattern recognition receptors, and they come in various classes. Of really broad range is the toll-like receptors, which recognize endotoxin, they recognize raw RNA, they recognize DNA, and they're localized in different parts of a cell. These receptors kind of identify non-self in a cell, and once they are triggered, they cause the cell to release type 1 interferons. And type 1 interferons are inflammatory and they cause the activation of immune cells. They cause neighboring cells to increase MHC class 1, which is
MHC is what?
A major histocompatibility complex 1 in the cells, and basically that system is always advertising to the immune system, these are the proteins we're making, right? And so almost like a cop, this is a bad analogy, but I don't know what else
on the
to.
Crossroads podcast, Jesus.
Sorry,
come on.
But your immune system comes to shake down all of your cells on a daily basis, and they frisk you. And if you've got something, if you're in possession of something that that is not yours, then they literally will degranulate on you. Essentially, they will unleash, a payload on you to kill that cell. It's a horrible analogy, but I don't know what. but the MHC class 1, when you become infected, neighboring cells, they receive this cytokine, interferon alpha and beta, and it tells the cells, hey guys, I think I'm infected, something's going on with me, turn up your surveillance. And so neighboring cells then increase expression of MHC class 1, which is presenting small peptides of all the proteins they're making inside of it. And what is amazing about that is your immune system comes by and they check your cells. And if they come across an MHC that is presenting a peptide that they've never seen, that you weren't born with, they know immediately, oh, you've been infected, you've got something. So viruses have evolved many strategies, not only to inhibit detection of the virus itself, to inhibit the signaling pathway that leads to NF-kappa B activation, which is just kind of an inflammatory pathway. And then the interferons also act, so those are acting on non-immune cells, but that interferon also alerts the immune system, come in, bring in some specialists that can survey the area.
Who are the specialists?
Specialists are your antigen presenting cells. So you've got monocytes, macrophages, B cells, and these cells come in specifically and to survey the area. They have these, they have enhanced pattern recognition receptors. And when they become activated, then they move to the lymph nodes. So they are the, who's this, Paul Revere, essentially, of the immune system.
You better come on with these references, damn it.
And so a macrophage, or even more importantly, there's a bigger player, a dendritic cell. Dendritic cells are they have the executive power to then turn on the immune system almost directly. They will produce interferon gamma. And so that tells T cells who are, and these analogies are just kind of analogies that I've received, at school, but, these T cells come in like Green Berets and like military to come in and wipe things out. And there's cells in the immune system that are specifically targeting some cells, and then there's some cells that just come in essentially like broad infantry that come to wipe out everything. And you can't have that, right? Because that causes problems.
Right.
And so with these infections, I think it sets off this cascade. And like I said, viruses have evolved to essentially block that system. It's such a powerful system. Now, what is interesting about the vaccines that were developed now, though, is we're essentially mimicking the viral mRNA, right? And so we essentially hijack our own cells with these vaccines to have our cells make these proteins that don't belong to us. So in traditional vaccines, we provide the protein exogenously, and those proteins are taken up by APCs, B cells primarily, and it's typically driving an antibody-driven immune response. And for some infections, that works. We have yet to be able to develop a vaccine, for example, that is antibody-mediated for HIV, and we've been working at this for 30 years or more. But the mRNA vaccines have the ability to induce antibody humoral responses as well as cell-mediated responses because of the nature of the vaccine. We are providing the instructions to the cells to produce their own foreign proteins. And in addition to that, they have built-in stimulators of the immune response. So it's incredible just working in the vaccine industry, knowing what it takes to produce a protein, which can take
an eternity,
forever, versus being able to produce a vaccine within 3 months, millions of doses in very small quantities, being able to release those products because the safety testing is so much simpler because a lot of that is done synthetically. So there's very little animal components or the potential exposure to adventitious viruses or contamination in the process. It's much more controlled. And the fact that based on the Wuhan strain, the studies, the clinical trials that were performed, they were seeing over 90% efficacy, which is unheard of for any kind of vaccine, right? So it is kind of crazy that in the times that we live in, that information and evidence like that is met with so much skepticism because it just hasn't been done before.
Yes.
At that scale.
Yes. And that's a thing that, and you and we've obviously talked a lot about this, but that is one of the main things that I can say personally was giving me some hesitation in getting the vaccine, because I'm like, I kind of have a vague idea how long this stuff takes. What do you mean you have a vaccine that you're ready to stick into people and it's been less than an eternity?
Yes.
How is that possible?
Right. Absolutely. No, it really is crazy to think how fast they were able to move. The unfortunate part is that the virus, in this case, the foe, is very plastic, is very dynamic. And so because we were able to respond so quickly, RNA viruses have the ability to mutate, to antigenically drift away rather quickly. This is the reason why, flu vaccine, flu is a RNA vaccine, RNA virus, and that undergoes significant genetic drift year to year. So this is why we have to have a vaccine every year. And RNA viruses are slippery like that. HIV being another that can undergo mutations and still be able to propagate.
Can I tell you a really funny, weird segue?
Sure.
So how I always imagined HIV, like when I learned about HIV, in college, I always like the shape of it, like the shape of the actual, I just imagined it sitting on top of your cell and just like pooping, just taking a dump, like right in, just injecting itself like straight in. That's how that's what helped me to kind of understand the science. But that's what viruses, but that's what viruses do in essence. They are like, and then they're like,
put this into you, and
like,
and now you're gonna
alien.
It's very alien. You're gonna do what I say. I'm gonna mind control you, and you're gonna spread my progeny all
over the place, because you're gonna like lose your lunch, apoptosis, and then and then you're just gonna, all my kids are just gonna be all over the place. Yeah, so it's disgusting, but that's how it stuck with me.
But that's the genius, I think, of these vaccines. We basically are mimicking the process that they do without replication. Right. We've encoded the viral genes into this mRNA. It gets encapsulated into a nanoparticle, and that gets absorbed by the cells. And the cells take up the mRNA, and they're like, a new mRNA? Well, let's start making this, making this protein.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that we can actually elicit an immune response using that same process.
We have literally crammed like a PhD and like undergrad vaccine development and, immunology into like 45 minutes. And I just want to that's just, what that is? That's Black and brown excellence. And that's what we're on.
And I hope we haven't gone off.
We've gone everywhere. We've gone everywhere. This is like when your mom was saying that, like, she just sat in the back of the car, but you're just like, Mom, lay down, and just drove around. That's basically what we did, except I'm sitting up and I'm like in the passenger seat or on the GPS. It's just like, whatever. I don't know. Have whatever analogy you like. We've had a lot of analogies today.
Yes.
Do you have any final thoughts before, because we're coming to a close?
Okay.
So do you have any things that you'd like us to be left with, sir? You've given us a lot, so don't feel obligated to give any more, but if you'd like.
I think the next 20 years in vaccinology and medicine are going to be as exciting, if not more exciting, than the last 20 years. Because I think the possibility of mRNA technology has opened up so many more opportunities, not just for addressing infectious disease, but cancer as a form of delivering gene therapy. And it is amazing to me how, you go through school and you learn this dogma about how, genes are made and proteins are made. And then someone comes out and says, hey, I figured out something else. There's groups that are working on circle RNAs that can produce essentially endless amounts of protein.
Wow.
Which may also be useful for making traditional vaccines in cell lines. But as a means of delivering gene therapy, I think it's going to be pretty fascinating. So people should definitely tune in to what's going on in that space around mRNA technology, and how that's going to, I think, also push forward the viral vector gene space. Maybe we can make those delivery modalities even better than they currently are. I think that in terms of reducing the cost of production and being able to deliver on some of these things, we may see a dramatic shift, which will benefit everyone, right? So currently, I can tell you from my own experience, it costs anywhere from $8 to $12 million to bring a phase 1 vaccine to completion. These things can be done for under $2 million. And so what is that going to do? I'm not saying that's the silver bullet for everything, but by reducing the cost, that gives us the ability to test more things. I've seen work on some of these mRNA vaccines that not only are eliciting humoral responses, but are also driving T cell responses. And that's going to be really important, I think, especially for inducing a more long-lasting immunity, and possibly also in the autoimmune space, being able to control T cells that get out of control and cause a lot of damage. So there's a lot of exciting stuff.
And when we talk about autoimmune, the things that we're talking about disease-wise, and you can stop me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's like lupus, things of that nature, where your immune system is attacking itself.
Yep. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of exciting things that are going to be coming up in this space as a result of this technology. And so I think it's important to keep track of it and keep up with it.
So how can people get in touch with you, sir? If you are cool with that, how can folk reach you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. And
for sure, you big old nerd.
I can you have that link or that information. I'll give it to you if you don't have it. You can also reach out to me at my work email, victor.ayala@ablinc.com. I can also provide you my personal email so that you have that information as well, which
that's
you have,
right.
But
I do.
You can share that as well. I'm always glad to talk about these things. I'm not. I don't have a podcast. I'm sorry, not a podcast. I don't have a blog or where I'm kind of discussing these things. But I do like talking about these topics, and I do love attending meetings and hearing the latest, and of course keeping up with the scientific literature. So always glad to share and discuss my thoughts on the subject, especially with you.
Yeah, because one more question. Who is your favorite? Another thing, Puerto Rico gives us so much. Where do we start? The rum, the coffee, the everything, the fine ass men. I was really over in Puerto Rico. I'm sorry. I was really over in Puerto Rico with just mouth agape. There was a man driving a pickup truck who looked just like John B. And I couldn't handle it. Like a lot of men there looked like John B. And his birthday was not too long ago. God bless that man. He is still fine to this day. But like, that's what's over there. And it's scary and wonderful. I just had to tell that story. Like I almost caught the rental on a pothole looking at that almost, but by his grace.
Well, I can confirm, I don't know about the men, but I can confirm the women are attractive as well. And so I went to the island and caught my own. So no.
Your wife is tired of you embarrassing.
She knows I'm just full of foolishness. I think one of the things that I am Puerto Rican, but I also think of myself as an outsider because when I got there, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that's really amazing when you go there is just the warmth of the people, and they love to gather and have family reunions. I mean, large family reunions and
massive family reunions.
And the other thing I think that is interesting is I think we like to entertain. As our artists, I always find it amazing the fact that, from such a small island, the number of artists in all kinds of spaces, right? Music, acting, painting, Broadway,
writing.
writing. There's very little spaces in the artistic world that you will not come across a Puerto Rican. And there's a saying back home that there's a Puerto Rican even on the face of the moon. Like, and the team from Mayagüez, the team from Mayagüez just launched a satellite recently. So we are small, but we're mighty. We're kind of big. We've got big passions. We've got big thought and lots of love.
I think that's going to be the episode title: "Small but Mighty." I think I found it. I didn't know. Part of me was thinking Preciosa because I was like, everybody will go up, because if you don't know, that is the anthem. The way Annie Up is the 90s anthem of New York. When the DJ drops that needle on Preciosa, you better get yourself prepared.
Your hairs get all goosebumps.
They tingle. It's like Nuck If You Buck in the early oddies. Let me tell you something. When that song, even to this day, when that song comes on, I will get my old sack of bones up and be ready to fight. Like, let's fight.
Let's do it.
We're never going to stop. See, this is how this is what happens when I invite my friends on. Like, people I actually like.
So much fun.
Yeah. I'm really glad you enjoyed yourself, because I knew it was going to be a really great conversation. I had no concerns about depth. And look at.
I know we've gone. We're we're old. I feel like we're old souls in that we know each other, and I feel that's it's really important to have people you can connect with like that.
It is, because I remembered very distinctly when I saw you, like when we first met, and you said something crazy to me, of course. And in my head, and I think I said it to you, I was like, that damn Victor. And you just busted out laughing. And I was like, aha.
We connect.
Yeah. I was like, I think this is going to work. And it, and it has. And there's so many great stories that, because, honestly, my experience in Puerto Rico feels like just any old day being in the South. Like, it feels like when I visit my family, it just feels like the South. Like, everybody's very friendly. Everybody's happy. Sunday, driving the highways in Puerto Rico on Sunday, because you know how it goes into the towns.
And you have to get pork on Sundays.
I don't know anything about that. The Crossroads podcast. Here, we actually made it all this time without you talking about pork.
We couldn't. You can't talk about Puerto Rico without talking about pork and mofongo.
Oh, shit.
Just to plug that too.
I know. I wish that I didn't. I don't know why pigs taste so good. I don't. It doesn't make sense to me. They're very smart animals and they taste real good, but I don't partake. But you told me that there is a pork street.
There's a pork town. And so people go up to this town, Wabate, and there's just lots of kiosks along the road, and you go and you enjoy live music and dancing and eating and drinking and good weather, all that good stuff on a Sunday. There's a genre of music that is associated with it. It's very romantic. So it's ballads from I would say, probably from the 40s and 60s. Música inolvidable. So they're ballads, and I can share some with you later. It is I hear that music and I instantly am moved, and in my mind I know exactly where I am in Puerto Rico on a Sunday afternoon, enjoying a cold beer and some good friends and having a good time. So it's pretty.
It is amazing. Really pretty. And the fact that the biggest issue you might have is that an iguana wants to eat mangoes in the street.
That's right.
Or also the potholes. But that's separate and not important, because at least they're circled. Now, I was complaining about that while I was there. Why is it circled? But it actually circle it. So when I'm enjoying myself and I'm vibing, I can say, oh shit. And
Yes.
Because seriously, I've dodged so many potholes. The one time looking at that fine ass man, and another one just because I was just trying to enjoy everything while I was driving. It's so beautiful. We'll be on here for for the rest of our days talking about. We have to go. So
okay.
We have to go. I do this with another one of my friends too. He and I will be on the all they're either on Zoom or recording for hours or just talking. And it's crazy. And then he's like, he'll try to make it out like he's not trying to keep me on the phone, like, well, I just wanted to ask you a question. And then before we know it, it's 2 hours later. So, friend, thank you so much.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you. So thank you.
Thank you. And everybody, we will see you again at the Crossroads.